It was a calm afternoon in the small city of Greenville, where a 10-year-old Darius Barnes sat quietly on his favorite bench in Oakwood Park. This was his routine most days after school, coming to the park to wait for his dad, Charles Barnes, the city's hard-working mayor. Charles had been taking care of Darius alone since his wife passed away 5 years ago. Despite his busy schedule, he made sure he'd find time to be there for his son, picking him up from the park to spend a few moments together before heading home. Darius liked the park. It was peaceful, and he could watch other kids play while waiting. He was a quiet boy, polite and always respectful, so he usually kept to himself unless someone invited him to play. On this particular day, he was sitting and humming softly to himself, not expecting anything unusual. The park wasn't too crowded, and there were a few empty benches around. Then, out of nowhere, a middle-aged woman with 2 young children approached him, her eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. "Excuse me, young man," she said sharply. Darius looked up politely, thinking maybe she needed directions or something. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice soft and respectful. "You need to move," she said, gesturing to the bench with a wave of her hand. "This bench is for me and my children. You can find somewhere else to sit." Darius looked around, puzzled. "But ma'am," he said, "there's a bench right there." He pointed to the empty one just a few steps away. He couldn't understand why she'd want this particular bench when others were available. The woman's face twisted with irritation. "Listen, kid," she said, her tone turning colder. "I don't care what you think. I said I want this bench, so you need to get up and find another spot. Don't be disrespectful." Darius blinked, taken aback by her tone. He was used to being polite and never liked causing trouble, but he knew he wasn't doing anything wrong by sitting here. Standing up for himself wasn't something he did often, but he felt he had every right to be here. "Ma'am, I'm just waiting for my dad," he replied calmly. "I'm not bothering anyone." The woman's face turned red with anger. "Disrespectful boy," she snapped. "You don't just talk back to adults like that." Then she reached into her purse, pulling out her phone. "If you're going to act like a troublemaker, then I'm calling the police." Darius sat quietly, watching her. He hadn't done anything wrong, so he figured there was no reason to be afraid. But he couldn't help feeling a strange tension in the air as the woman dialed. The call was brief, and after she hung up, the woman crossed her arms and stood over him, waiting. Her children, meanwhile, were playing in the park. The minutes passed, and soon, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, getting closer by the second. When the police car arrived, a familiar figure stepped out. It was Officer Stevens, a kind man who knew Darius and his dad. He walked over, a confused look on his face as he approached the scene. The woman's face lit up when she saw him, as if she'd won a small victory. "Officer, this boy is being disrespectful and refusing to move from the bench," she said, folding her arms with a smug smile. Officer Stevens glanced at Darius, who was sitting quietly, and then back at the woman. "Ma'am, I know this young man," he said slowly, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. "He's Mayor Barnes's son. I've never known him to cause any trouble." He paused, waiting for her reaction, as the woman's face began to change. Just then, a man walked in. It was Darius's dad, Mayor Charles Barnes, looking sharply at the scene unfolding in front of him. Charles Barnes walked up with a calm but firm presence, his gaze shifting between his son, Officer Stevens, and the woman. He knew Darius to be well-behaved and couldn't imagine what might have led to this scene. Charles had always raised his son with respect for others, and he trusted Darius to handle himself responsibly. But he could also see the discomfort in his son's eyes as he sat on the bench, and he knew this was more than just a misunderstanding. "Is there a problem here?" Charles asked. The woman looked at him, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. She straightened her shoulders and attempted to regain her composure. "Yes, there is," she said, looking at Charles defiantly. Your son here was refusing to move when I asked him to. He was sitting on the bench I wanted to use, and when I asked him politely to move, he refused and disrespected me. Charles glanced at Darius, who met his gaze with a quiet nod. Is that true, Darius? He asked softly. No, Dad, Darius replied. I didn't say anything rude. I just told her I was waiting for you. There were other benches available, but she wanted this one. I didn't understand why, so I just stayed where I was. Charles took a slow breath, his gaze shifting back to the woman. Ma'am, my son didn't do anything wrong by sitting here. It's a public park, and he has as much right as anyone to be here. The woman's face flushed, her indignation only growing. I don't care who you or your son are, she snapped. I felt disrespected, and I expect something to be done about it. Maybe if you raised him to show more respect to his elders, we wouldn't be having this problem. Charles remained composed, but his eyes darkened at her words. He glanced at Officer Stevens, who was standing uncomfortably between the two parties, unsure of how to respond. The officer had known Mayor Barnes long enough to respect him deeply, and he could sense that this wasn't just about a park bench. Officer Stevens, Charles said, turning to him, can I have a moment alone with this woman? Stevens hesitated but then nodded, stepping back and giving the mayor some space. The woman's expression shifted as she realized that her backup was now walking away. Charles turned back to her with a low but firm voice. Ma'am, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you've crossed the line here. My son has every right to be here without being harassed. And if your issue is because of his appearance, I assure you that won't stand. The woman looked away, her bravado fading as Charles continued. Let me make myself clear, Charles said. This city doesn't tolerate discrimination. I don't tolerate it, and I certainly won't allow my son to be treated this way. You have no right to make him feel unwelcome in his own park. He's just a boy, here to enjoy his time and wait for his father. The woman looked away, her face turning red. She muttered something under her breath, but Charles wasn't done. There will be consequences for this behavior, he said calmly. We have witnesses here. Officer Stevens can attest to everything that happened. I won't let this incident go by without addressing it in a formal complaint. The woman's face turned pale. She knew a formal complaint from the mayor himself would carry serious consequences. The people in Greenville respected Charles Barnes and her actions, so if reported, could easily reach her workplace and social circles. The thought of her reputation being damaged in the community struck fear in her, and she looked away, swallowing her pride. Fine, she muttered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean. She trailed off, unable to find the words. Charles looked at her one last time. I hope you understand that your actions today were not only unnecessary but harmful. And as the mayor of this city, I will ensure that justice is served fairly. With that, he took Darius's hand, guiding him away from the scene. As they walked toward their car, Darius looked up at his father and had a hint of relief. But Charles knew that the hurt from this experience would linger. The following morning, Charles couldn't shake off the look in Darius's eyes. His son had faced moments like these before, but this was the first time Charles had witnessed it firsthand. And now, he knew he had to take action, not just for Darius but for every other child who might face the same unjust treatment. Charles drafted a formal report of the incident, naming both the woman and Officer Stevens as witnesses. He sent the complaint to the Greenville City Council and asked for a public statement addressing the importance of inclusivity and respect in their community parks. News spread quickly. People in Greenville were talking about the mayor's stance, and many parents supported his actions. Charles received emails and letters from parents and teachers alike, thanking him for standing up against intolerance. Darius became a symbol of resilience in the community, with people rallying behind him. 2 weeks later, the city council held a public meeting to discuss the incident, and the new measures being proposed to prevent such incidents in the future. Charles stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "This isn't just about my son," he began. "This is about every child in Greenville, every family that calls this city home. We're a community that stands for respect, not prejudice. And I want to ensure that our parks, our schools, and our streets are safe and welcoming for everyone." The council members nodded in agreement, and after a unanimous vote, a new policy was passed to increase public awareness about anti-discrimination laws in the city. The woman from the park was issued a formal warning and was required to attend a community workshop on diversity and inclusion. In the days that followed, Darius returned to Oakwood Park, and this time, he was greeted warmly by others in the community. The kids in the park knew his story, and many even joined him on the bench to play games or chat while they waited for their parents. Darius felt a new sense of belonging, knowing that his father had stood up for him and made a real change. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Kindly subscribe for more thrilling stories. Like and share this video. Have a nice day.